Dublin, where the palm trees grow, by Hugo Hamilton. Chapter 1. The Supremacy of Grief. One eye is half shut, while the other is open, so we don't know whether it's drunkenness or whether he is looking out with deep anger. He hasn't said a word for a while. His arms and legs are limp, restrained by the shape of the armchair. We don't know whether he is about to fall asleep or whether he will soon begin to mutter or talk or even shout. Whether he might say something terribly funny or terribly tragic, or whether he is building up a general resentment of all around him. One eye is ajar, but the other is fully open, looking across the room at the opposite wall. Anyone looking at his eyes might draw upon himself the full force that lies behind them. He's had a lot to drink, of course, not without reason. His wife, Sarah, died only 5 days ago. Even at the funeral, he was unpredictable, showing little sign of emotion and listening to the many semi-sincere condolences, either with too much interest or an obvious lack of it. He looked at people's shoes. At the graveside, he nudged his brother to point out the extraordinary hat which one of Sarah's relatives wore. "Would you ever look at that hat, for Christ's sake?" he said, almost for everyone to hear. And later in the day, there was the row with the same brother for turning his wife's funeral into a party. "It's just an excuse for a party. Have you forgotten that my wife has just died?" The outburst was enough to return a degree of solemnity to the gathering and to remind everyone that nobody had more right than he to find solace in laughter, that all mirth was at his discretion. The next day it was decided that he should spend a few days in Dublin. Nobody knows when the real grief sets in. Nobody knows what a man alone in his grief might do. They had no children, and it was considered better or safer for him to be in company for a while longer. At his own instructions, his two sisters, Grain and Marita, had gone through Sarah's possessions, sharing what clothes and jewelry they could use and arranging for the rest to be disposed of, so that no trace of his wife, except the wedding photo and the well-kept gardens, would remain on his return. Then he was brought to Dublin in the car, stopping frequently for drinks to hold back the emptiness. Arriving well after 7 in the evening, he began to embrace and kiss everyone excessively, saying, "What a fecking life! What a shagging life, eh?" To which nobody knew how to respond, not knowing whether he was serious or not, other than to hand him a further gin and tonic and direct him to the armchair where he has been sitting ever since. The drink is on a small table beside him, virtually untouched. His two sisters sit on the sofa together, discussing the details of the funeral with their cousin Deirdre. They throw occasional glances over at Damien in the armchair. Grain, or Auntie Grain, has just shifted her position in order to cross her legs, and feeling the renewed comfort in her muscles, continues to describe the funeral. It was magnificent. To emphasize, she shakes her head very slowly while looking earnestly into the listener's eyes. The two children in the house keep running from the kitchen into the sitting room and back. At one point, they stop to look at Uncle Damien's watch. Without altering the 1.5 ratio in his eyes, he smiles at them and urges them to try the watch on themselves. One of them walks around proudly with the large watch, while the other clamors to have a go. They are wearing their best dresses with ribbons at the back. The father Paul, who sits on the other side of the fireplace, tells them to give the watch back before they break it. In doing this, they giggle because Uncle Damien makes it difficult by spreading his fingers out. The girls look intensely at the tufts of hair on his fingers and along the side of his hand. They look at his buttons, his face, and his ears. They soon disappear again into the kitchen where their mother is cooking. Uncle Damien looks at a large drink stain below Paul's chair without seeing it. He stares at the two objects on the mantelpiece without absorbing them. The miniature wooden snake emerging from a basket and the brass tortoise which can be used as an ashtray. Auntie Granny has just glanced at Uncle Damien and turns to Paul. Paul, you haven't told Damien about your new job. Turning to Damien, she repeats the catalyst. Did you know that Paul had a fantastic new job with IBM? Yeah, bugger. Uncle Damien looks over at Paul. Well, congratulations. I always knew you were marked out for it. Paul is like most people. He talks about his job. He prefers to talk about anything but Uncle Damien's wife. He doesn't want to stir the heavy sediment of grief. His conversation ignores the most prominent issue on Uncle Damien's mind. The two sisters on the couch have also been avoiding any mention of Sarah. They don't talk about her face. They don't talk about her things. They won't quote her. They won't mention her absence or her former presence. It is almost as if Sarah had been a very bad woman. Every time the children open the door of the sitting room, a faint smell of soup comes in with them from the kitchen. The smell is foreign. Uncle Damien's mouth is sealed. It looks as though he is about to make a very serious observation. It also looks as though he is about to say something very funny. When the children interrupt to look at his watch again, he continues to look at Paul without listening. He waits for a moment and turns to the girls. I want you to do something for me. Will you go into your mummy and tell her that if it's not the duck à l'orange, I'm not eating it. Duck à l'orange. Have you got that? Uncle Damien looks at them seriously. His speech is slow and deliberate. The children repeat duck à l'orange and run away into the kitchen from where the vague smell of food is impossible to identify. The two sisters, Auntie Grain and Auntie Marita, are both angled slightly towards Deirdre, who is telling them about a recent burglary at her house. Above the mantelpiece hangs a painted picture of a boat leaning to one side on a strand, the tide having receded far away into the distance. Behind Uncle Damien there are green plants, bushy ferns, and drooping stalks, enough for him to hide in thick undergrowth if he were to move back. The curtains are a mass of falling leaves. Uncle Damien moves forward to speak to Paul, much in the same way as he might talk about something he read in the paper. Do you know that I had a very, very beautiful wife called Sarah? Paul is surprised at the words. Uncle Damien is looking at him, and the pause demands a response. Paul searches and rejects all the possible answers. She was indeed, or she must have been, or no doubt about it. After a moment, when it's almost too late, Paul says, I think everybody knows that. Do you think so, really? Uncle Damien preserves the equilibrium between a joke and something very serious on his face. It seems as though he doesn't need to blink. In an effort to punctuate the conversation, Paul adds, "Definitely." But Uncle Damien continues, "There's only one serious regret that I have." He pauses again. "There's something I should have told her. I always wanted to tell her, even as far back as 10 years ago. I kept meaning to tell her about it, but I always stopped myself when the moment came. I thought I would save her the trouble. Do you know that even on her deathbed, I had a great urge to tell her everything, but I just couldn't. And now it's too late. Is it one thing that kills me?" Paul wants to ask him what it was, but won't let himself. He doesn't want to appear inquisitive. He expects Uncle Damien to tell him anyway. But the children rush in the door saying, "She said you're very, very bold. You have to come in for your dinner now." "Is it duck à l'orange? If it isn't, I'm not eating." "Come in for your dinner," they shout. "I can't. I'm stuck in this chair. You're going to have to pull me out." His left eye remains half shut. His arms are still limp along the armrests. The girls make an effort to pull them, but they only make him look heavier and sleepier. "Look, girls, stop frigging about. One of you pull this arm and you pull the other." Paul stands up and waits by the door, smiling at the effort his daughters need to extract Uncle Damien from the chair. With a little more success, they manage to pull him forward. They believe that their own strength has achieved this and pull even harder. "Come on, girls, you'll have to do better than that," Uncle Damien says. They pull again, and he moves forward a little more. But instead of standing up, he begins to sink deliberately and heavily to his knees, and when they keep pulling, he finally collapses onto his back on the floor. The older of the girls says, "Oh no," and giggles. They try to pull him up again, but Uncle Damien is playing dead. One eye is still half open, but the other is still completely shut now. Paul discovers by looking at his head why Uncle Damien always carries a half funny, half serious expression. It's the shape of the head. It's still a schoolboy's head. Dara has come in from the kitchen to tell everyone to sit down for dinner. When she finds Uncle Damien on the floor, she laughs and says, "Uncle Damien, come on now, time for dinner." One of the children lets go of an arm which falls loosely on the floor. Aunt Marita gets up from the sofa followed by the others. Deirdre walks straight out to go to the bathroom. Aunt Marita begins to talk to Damien like a child. "Damien, what are you doing on the floor? Up you get now, dinner's ready." But Uncle Damien seems to ignore everyone and continues to play dead. Nobody believes him. Everybody is sure he's only putting it on. Even though he looks completely lifeless, they know he's alive. Dead people generally look like they're grinning underneath. Aunt Marita doesn't like it. It's beneath his dignity to act dead like that. She reaches down and begins to pull at his arm. "Come on, Damien, up you get now, you're keeping everybody waiting." Dara joins in and begins to pull at the other arm, saying, "The food is going cold." But Uncle Damien even ignores this plea for courtesy and remains lifeless with his dead man's grin. Aunt Marita almost stumbles with the effort. "Damien, you're too heavy," she says. They manage to pull his shoulders up, but his head falls back, and his Adam's apple is pointing at the ceiling. Nobody knows the difference between a dead man and a man who wants to play dead. They look the same. Perhaps they also feel the same. Nobody knows the difference between a dead man and the man whose wife is dead, and who himself is acting dead. The two women pull energetically. They have given up pleading with Uncle Damien and have begun to plead with Paul to help them. Paul declines and remains at the door with one hand in his pocket. He doesn't want to help a man who doesn't want help. If he were to join in, it would make Uncle Damien look helpless. Auntie Marita is breathless. Everybody is now concerned with getting Uncle Damien up. His half-closed eye still stares up at nothing. The more they pull, the heavier he seems to get. They have stopped depending on Uncle Damien's own strength and demand help from Paul. Dara looks up at Paul seriously. "Paul, come on now. All the food is going cold. Give us a hand." Paul capitulates under this renewed pressure and goes over to join in. But as he takes hold of Uncle Damien's wrist and begins to pull slowly, the eyes open wide and look straight up at Paul. We don't know whether the eyes are opened in anger or in disbelief, whether he opened them to see something or say something, to perceive or transmit, whether they are open to find out if he's alive, or whether to tell Paul that there was never any doubt about it. Paul immediately releases his hold on the wrist and steps back. Uncle Damien gets up of his own accord. As they walk in to take their places at the table, the thought of food makes them forget. Nobody remembers what Uncle Damien looks like dead.